Go back to 10 years ago. You wrote a book about it, Overhaul.
I did.
Right, which I read. And
Thank you.
but put us back 10 years ago and where the auto industry was and how we got to the terrible situation we were in.
Well, it was a perfect storm, of course. You had a mix of the economy cratering. You had a mix of the companies being over-leveraged. You had oil prices that were quite high before the great financial crisis hit. And then you had a dry up of consumer credit. And remember, something like 80% of cars are bought on credit. So all this came together, and the car companies literally kind of drove off a cliff.
So let's remind people exactly what that bailout entailed. We have a full screen that indicate it was like something like $82 billion you had to put in.
Yeah.
You got back about $72 billion. It was about $10 billion net. But that doesn't take into account things like the taxes that wouldn't have gotten paid to the government because people lost their jobs, or the FICA payments that wouldn't have paid, or for that matter, the 2.6 million jobs that some estimates have said you saved.
Look, our view was and is that for $10 billion, we saved an industry that potentially involved 1 million jobs or something like that. Now, obviously, over time, they would have regenerated in some form or fashion. But if you want to talk about how stimulus money should have been spent during that period, I have no qualms about the $10 billion that we didn't quite get back to the Treasury.
Who took a haircut? Somebody has to lose in that.
In what sense?
And who lost money? I mean, was it bondholders? Was it equity holders? Was it employees by taking lower wages? How did it work?
Look, our view is that we enforced the rules of capitalism. The shareholders were wiped out. The bondholders took substantial haircuts. And the workers were asked to give up part of their benefits and part of their wages going forward in order to make the car companies profitable again. So our mantra was shared sacrifice by all stakeholders, and we think we achieved that.
And give us an update now where the car industry is overall from your point of view. I mean, General Motors seems to be doing reasonably well. Ford, actually, who didn't have to take the bailout because they'd already borrowed a lot of money, is actually struggling. Fiat Chrysler is a different company.
So remember that the Czar, the average number of cars, the annual number of cars sold, was around 17 million before the crisis. It dropped to below 10 million during the crisis. Couldn't make money in a fixed cost business at that level. The restructuring that we oversaw with the companies was to reduce the break-even point for these companies to the 10, 11 million, 10, 9.5 even million range. Now we have the Czar back up in the 16 to 17 million range. So obviously these companies are hugely profitable again.
I mean, the job that you had to do must have been, you're so calm now, but that must have been unbelievably overwhelming. I mean, take these companies, not let them fail, like say a Lehman failed, take them through bankruptcy, and then out of bankruptcy at the same time. What was your experience? Like, what was the biggest takeaway for you?
Well, I woke up every morning, Alex, saying to myself...
You slept?
I did sleep. I woke up every morning saying to myself, I can't make this worse. That gave me some solace in terms of my fear. Look, I have two basic takeaways from the whole process, for what it's worth. One is that there is a role for government when markets fail. And this was a clear case of a market failure. And as I said earlier, a clear case that for a relatively modest amount of money, we saved a huge number of jobs. Related to that, I would also point out that without the TARP legislation, we could not have saved these companies. We would have had to go to Congress. Congress would have dillied and dathered, and they never would have acted in time. So having the TARP money was essential. And the last point I'd make, especially for a business audience, is my lesson learned was that management mattered. Here you had a company, General Motors, one of the great icons of our country, that literally had the worst financial controls, the worst discipline, the worst decision-making process of almost any company I'd ever seen. And by the way, at that point in time, Ford was doing great. Right. And they had the same set of problems GM had, but they addressed them differently.
Well, what caused that to happen? Because it raises the question, may it be happening somewhere around the country right now? Because if it's in your book that they didn't really know how to count the money. They didn't know what the cash situation was in the company. But I just recently spoke with a senior GM officials currently who says exactly the same thing. Says it was a mess. We didn't know. We didn't have the mechanism in place. What failed in capitalism that didn't force them to get the right mechanisms? Because that might be failing right now someplace.
Corporate governance. In a nutshell, it was corporate governance. The board, as I also wrote in my book, I don't think exercised its real fiduciary responsibilities. If they had, they would have asked the kinds of questions we asked. If they had, frankly, Rick Wagner, who was a dedicated, good, decent, honorable, smart guy, but he just couldn't run the company, they would have made that change sooner. It was a failure of corporate governance.